This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason. In this episode 850 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show, it had its typical hits and misses, but it was one of the stronger ones of the season. On the wrong side of things was Josh Dobbs. He ended up getting benched. Dontavian Wicks didn't really come through, though he did get hurt in the fourth quarter. And Roschon Johnson didn't have the role that I thought that he would have. Elijah Moore also didn't see a great target share with Amari Cooper active. But Jake Browning and Joe Flacco, they were both good streaming options at quarterback. Juju Smith-Schuster had his best outing of the year. Tajay Spears scored 17.8 PPR points, Isaiah Likely and Cade Otton both found the end zone, and Chase Brown had a big day. I'd honestly take that kind of result each week. And I hope that I can get those results for you during these very, very important playoff weeks. Let's get to it. We'll kick things off by looking at players rostered between 10 and 50% of Yahoo leagues, and as usual, we'll start at quarterback. I'll just be real with you guys. I don't think the quarterback streaming choices this week are very good. I don't think they're in amazing spots. Everyone will understandably want to play Jake Browning, and I think he's a fine enough play, like a mid QB2 play. But I have some concerns. So instead of just sitting here and saying, hey, Jake Browning's been great the last couple of weeks, I want to give you the downside of Browning, just so that you have both sides when making your decision. Browning faced two top 10 advantageous matchups over his last two games, and that's by adjusted points allowed. He also scored a rushing touchdown in both of those games. That's not something that we can confidently bank on. And he's also seen a high number of yards come on screens. Minnesota hasn't allowed a QB1 performance since week 5. That's who Browning gets this week. They're a bottom 10 opponent by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Browning has the weapons. He has a good offensive environment. But I don't think that it's all butterflies and rainbows. I've seen him discussed with like Matthew Stafford and Sam Howell this week. I'm far more comfortable with those two quarterbacks, more so than Browning. He's still an okay streamer though, because there's really not a ton out there. Gardner Minshew's another one who's sure, he's fine. He can come through with an okay performance. But like I said on 15 transactions, I'm not sure the ceiling's there. Regardless, Minshew gets Pittsburgh. The Colts have the 11th best implied team total on this week's slate. And the Steelers are coming off a game where Bailey Zappi finishes the QB7. Again, I don't love Minshew necessarily, but I think he's fine if you're struggling at the position. Next up, Joe Flacco. I think all three of these quarterbacks are sort of in the same tier this week. Chicago's the best matchup on paper of the group, ranking 15th in adjusted points allowed for quarterbacks this year, but they've looked better defensively over their last few games, so there's a little bit of a concern there. Flacco's been competent in this offense, and Cleveland has an implied team total according to FanDuel Sportsbook that's above 20. So it's not a horrible situation in today's landscape. Now moving on to running backs, at the time of this recording, Ty Chandler's percent roster number on Yahoo is still well below 50%. Alexander Madison's banged up though. He may not go this week. At the time of this recording, I don't know for sure if Madison's gonna go or not. But if he doesn't go, Chandler would be in store for a potential 15-touch day. And he gets the Bengals, and that rush defense ranks in the bottom 10 this season in rushing yards over expected per rush allowed. I'd anticipate some receiving work for Chandler too. So he's a good play if there's no Madison. Now moving on, let's talk a little bit more about D'Onta Foreman. I had mentioned on the 15 transaction show on Tuesday that Foreman was the 1A in that Chicago backfield this past week, and that's true. He had a 73% running back rush share and almost a 10% target share. Foreman's route participation was at a season-high 44% in Week 14. He obviously has a tough opponent this week against Cleveland, but from a volume perspective, he might be okay enough in the flex. I'm also going to bring up the Chiefs' backfield again. If Isaiah Pacheco's out, I'm leaning more towards Clyde Edwards-Helaire this week than Jerick McKinnon, because CEH out-touched McKinnon last week. McKinnon's looking more like the pass-catching threat, maybe the goal line back, but we may not see the Chiefs in a negative game script against New England. So that leads me to believe that it's a better script for Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I do think it's unbelievably close, though. I'm not sitting here saying that it's very obviously CEH. And because of that, I think both of these guys are in play. I just very, very, very slightly prefer Clyde Edwards-Helaire if Pacheco's out. Now, wide receiver, I'm going to cheat a little bit here. Josh Downs is rostered in a little over 50% of leagues. but I want to mention him because he's in such a great spot against Pittsburgh. The Steelers have surrendered by far the highest yards per route run rate out of the slot. They are horrible against slot players. Josh Downs has run 82% of his routes from that area of the field this year. And while he hasn't seen great target shares over his last two, his route participation has been in the 79-80% range. That's where it's been most of the season. He hasn't scored double-digit PPR points in 5 straight games. That's partially due to injury, but it's still somewhat of a red flag. It's still somewhat of a concern. Even still, I think this could be the week where he gets back on track. Zay Jones has a tough matchup against a Ravens team that's been the 7th worst matchup for wideouts this year by adjusted points allowed. But as I talked about in the 15 Transaction Show, Jones is seeing more work without Christian Kirk. Over his last two, he's seen target shares of 20.5% and 28.6%. Now, the production really hasn't been there, but the volume has been, and Jones is primarily a perimeter receiver. The Ravens rank 25th in slot target share allowed, meaning teams are targeting the outside against them at a higher than average rate. So Jones is fine in a deeper format this week. Noah Brown works too if CJ Stroud ends up playing. I'd be less inclined to use him with Davis Mills, but if CJ Stroud goes, I don't mind Brown. He gets Tennessee. The Titans are a top 5 matchup for wideouts by adjusted points allowed, and Nico Collins is likely out this week. That would give Brown a higher than normal floor. And yeah, I know Noah Brown has put up back-to-back goose eggs. That's a very scary thing. But keep in mind that his route participation over his last two has been 88% and 80%. And without Collins, those numbers might be even higher. He also saw an 18.5% target share just last week. Demario Douglas is back. He's still rostered in only 18% of leagues, despite a 24% target share per game rate over his last 5. The matchup this week isn't amazing against Kansas City, but if a negative game script hits, the Patriots might throw the ball more than usual. So he's a nice volume-based play. Now, tight end's a little bit rough this week, but I don't totally mind Logan Thomas, mostly because of the matchup. Thomas himself hasn't been all that great over his last two. He's combined for just 5.5 PPR points. His target shares in those games, 9 and 4.5%. But his route participation, it's still okay at about 63%. And he gets a Rams team that's been the 3rd best matchup this year by adjusted points allowed to tight ends. And then there's also Chig Okonkwo in this tier. Chig gets Houston, and the Texans have allowed the 2nd highest adjusted target share to tight ends this year. So teams are targeting tight ends at a higher rate when they face Houston. Chig has also scored higher end tight end 2 numbers in each of his last 3. And he saw a strong 75% route participation in week 14. So I don't mind Okonkwo this week. The next tier of players consists of guys rostered in 0 to 10% of Yahoo leagues, so they're desperation plays, mostly. We'll start with a quarterback, and that's Nick Mullins. I don't feel great about it, but Mullins is in a good spot against Cincinnati. The Bengals have been a top half opponent for quarterbacks this year and adjusted points allowed, and Mullins has a decent supporting cast as long as Justin Jefferson's okay. Cincinnati's below average in pressure rate, they're 1st in air yards per attempt allowed, and they're below average in passing EPA per dropback allowed. Look, it's insanely risky. I can't imagine playing Mullins in the playoffs in a single quarterback league. But at least the spot that he's in, it's okay. Next is the Raiders running backs. By the time you listen to this, you might know exactly what's going on with Josh Jacobs, because they play on Thursday night. I don't know for sure right now. But if he doesn't go because of the injury that he's dealing with, I think Zamir White's a pretty decent play. Like I said in the 15 transactions episode, I'd anticipate White being the early down in the goal line guy while seeing some work through the air. And then Amir Abdullah, who's also a sleeper, he would see the pass catching work. The thing is, Vegas is set to be in a low scoring game where they could see a neutral or positive game script. So that would favor Zamir White in my opinion. I prefer White because his touch projection is just stronger than Abdullah's. It's a plus matchup too, with the Chargers surrendering the 11th most adjusted points to running backs this year. Now, another injury that's up in the air is with Brian Robinson. He didn't practice on Wednesday after suffering a hamstring injury the last time that we saw the Commanders, which would mean that Antonio Gibson and Chris Rodriguez would get a bump if Robinson were sidelined. If you're choosing between those two running backs, I would definitely choose Gibson. He would hypothetically see more early down work, and we know that he can see work out of the backfield as a pass catcher. But here's the thing, Washington's not competitive. They might want to see what they have in Chris Rodriguez. That's more of a subjective feeling thing, but it's true too. There's a possibility that they go that direction without Robinson. Maybe they would give him some higher valued touches. He's a bigger bodied back who's capable of handling a big workload. So Antonio Gibson would be the play if Brian Robinson's sidelined. But don't sleep on Chris Rodriguez either. And that game environment against the Rams, it actually could be decent. Now, speaking of that game, Tutu Atwell is currently in concussion protocol. Demarcus Robinson's coming off a game against Baltimore where he ran a route on 98% of LA's dropbacks. He ended the day with a 26% target share. Now he's going to face the second best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Demarcus Robinson makes a ton of sense this week as a deep sleeper. I mentioned Noah Brown earlier, but I'm a little bit intrigued by Robert Woods this week too, his teammate. The Titans have allowed the 6th highest target share this season to the slot, and Robert Woods has lined up in the slot on a team-high 54% of his routes run. Without Nico Collins, like I said in the 15 Transaction Show, we're likely going to see a rotation of wide receivers for Houston. I still believe that. But Woods is likely going to play a lot in the slot. Last week, without Collins for a lot of that game, he was at a 56% slot rate. Now, I don't know if his ceiling's really high, but if CJ Stroud is active, I don't mind Woods. One player I was close to mentioning on the 15 Transaction Show this week was Michael Wilson. He's been practicing so far this week, and Hollywood Brown, at the time of this recording, he hasn't. Not only could that boost Michael Wilson's target share, but he's also facing San Francisco. And for what it's worth, the 49ers were the team earlier this year that Michael Wilson crushed. He scored 26.6 PPR points against them. That was his best outing of the year. But before going down with his injury, Wilson had seen target shares of 15%, 17%, and 19%. He's also played exactly one game with Kyler Murray, and that game was where he had that 19% target share. So I think Wilson's a deep play in general, but he could see an even bigger target share if Hollywood Brown is sidelined. I really like any of the healthy Packers wide receivers this week, so do note that. The Buccaneers secondary has been really bad, but they haven't been great against tight ends either, and that's where Tucker Kraft comes into play. Kraft has seen an 80% route participation in 2 of his last 3, and he hit a double-digit percentage target share in each of his last 2. Tampa Bay is the 11th best tight end matchup by adjusted fantasy points allowed, and they've given up an above-average target share allowed to tight ends too. So you could look at Kraft as a streamer, and some of the deeper Packers wide receivers if you'd like to. And then I'm going to repeat the transaction from earlier this week with Davis Allen. Allen saw a 13% target share, and he ran around on 63% of Matthew Stafford's dropbacks last week. Now he gets a plus matchup against Washington, so if the tight ends around him are banged up officially, Allen's a fun, super deep play. At defense this week, I'm pretty surprised that Vegas is still rostered in just 15% of leagues. They've been a top 10 defense in 5 of their last 6, and they face Easton Stick as favorites on Thursday night. So I think they're definitely in play as a streamer. And you could even go in that same matchup and use the Chargers on the other side. The over-under in this game is super, super low. And the Raiders have allowed a top 6 defensive performance in 3 of their last 4 and 5 of their last 7. Now you could also go with Atlanta against Carolina, the Rams against the Commanders if they're still out there. Remember, the Rams have a really good fantasy playoff schedule. And then a little bit deeper, you've got the Bengals against Minnesota. I may like Nick Mullins as a super deep sleeper, but we know that situation can go south. And then Indianapolis is a pretty strong play against Pittsburgh as well if they're available. With all the quarterback injuries across the league, finding a defensive streamer, it's not as difficult these days. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. I'll talk to you tomorrow with a new Late Round Perspectives episode. But first, there's going to be a mailbag episode that drops. Talk to you then.